Hi everyone, I'm Harm Sanabria, and I'm here with
Tejal Matthew.
mhm. My role over here at Plano West Model UN is the Crisis Vice President and Aspertasial.
I'm the crisis parliamentarian.
hmm And what we do is we essentially oversee teaching, lecturing crisis, hosting crisis committee simulations all across the three West Cluster schools, chapter, Shepton, Jasper, and Plano West. And we were also in charge of playing a managerial role during the PW11 conference and hosting and organizing the crisis committees we had at that conference. So today we're just going to be going over some Model UN crisis committee basics, allow you to kind of get a feel for how crisis works and how it differentiates from your standard Model UN committee. So um, we have a guide here for the entirety of crisis parliamentary procedure. So feel free to pause the video, scan that. Next slide, Tejal. Thank you. And here we have a couple of notes in regard to this very lecture that can kind of allow you to easily understand the flow of this video. Next slide, Tejal. So, quick intro to Crisis Committee. So, Crisis Committee is a more fast-paced, chaotic version of your standard Model UN committee. Crisis delegates represent either a country or a character, which is pretty unique, while the events of this crisis unfold. So, your objective is to respond to such events and to such crises, which are introduced by the crisis staff through these crisis updates, which we'll get into in a little bit. But in essence, you just need to keep in mind it's a very more fast-paced, more chaotic. There are more things to do, more issues to address in a more timely manner. So it is a little bit harder than standard, but it's definitely more fun for that same reason. So it is definitely a very enjoyable and a very fruitful experience. Next slide, Tejal.
Okay, so I'm going to be covering session opening and round robin. So basically, crisis is different from standard in that you don't have the general speakers list. There's no need to start like you don't have to raise your placard or anything. Basically, you can start in two ways. You can have round robin or you can have moderated caucus. So in round robin, everyone in the committee gives a speech, and it's generally like in order of how you're sitting. And it's the same thing as a speakers list. You're giving your position, your country, your character's position on the topic at hand, and you want to have like the same composure, be respectful, be like have initiative, and the same thing applies. It's just different structure. This is what's really important to crisis is going to make your entire committee experience is your crisis arc. So depending on what country, your character, and the topic of the committee, you have your own personal interests that you want to work towards. And that's what makes crisis different from standard is that there's more individual power. So you have to have the research of what your resources are, like at that historical time period, if it is historical or if it's in the future, you want to know like the background of your character and your country so that you can more effectively, pass directives and which we'll get to later, or make an impact in the committee that the chairs will recognize. And crisis updates are another thing that make crisis different from standard because the issue is ongoing. So depending on what actions you take, your directives that you make, or the directives that the whole committee makes, the crisis staff will come in and act out the changes that are occurring that your committee has to actively respond to. So the way that you affect crisis updates is by passing directives both as a committee and as an individual. And then the crisis staff will introduce new problems for you to solve that you have to act to very quickly in order to create a positive effect.
Right. Thank you, Tejal. One of the more unique and important aspects of furthering your goals, both as a committee and as a committee member and as an individual delegate, is through these directives. So directives are really nothing more than your standard Model UN resolutions, except they are action orders. You are taking actions. There are no suggested resolutions. There are no suggested solutions to the problem. It is action orders. You're sort of saying that this will happen, not requesting. Um, but there's also two different unique kinds of directives, which are your personal directives, and stemming off of those personal directives are your joint personal directives. So a personal directive is essentially you writing a secret note in which you are issuing action orders on behalf of your country or your character. So with the use of your portfolio powers, which will move which I'll briefly cover in a second, you are kind of furthering your own personal goals by writing these notes, which are the catalyst by which you take action on an individual basis. Now, as for these joint personal directives, you are kind of trying to further your own goals with the help of another person or another delegate in your block. So if another delegate shares similar interests or views to that of your own, you can both write a joint personal directive. Now, the only issue with this is that you give up that secrecy that you once had in writing your personal directive by yourself. But on the other hand, you now have an expanded bay and expanded number of resources which you can make use of, and an expanded number of portfolio powers which you can use in order to, and you can accommodate in order to put toward furthering that goal. So whenever you're running a joint personal directive, um, while you do risk being betrayed and you do risk your plans being leaked to the public and to the committee, it's just best that you rely on doing it with someone or another delegate who is in your block and who is less likely to betray you for that same reason. So you need a memorable title, you need an addressee, specific orders or action orders, what your goals or expectations are, and a signature with your title or the title of someone else who is signing on and contributing to that directive. Next slide, Tejal. Thank you. So you need to be very swift in delivering these personal directives in the flow of crisis. While everything is going on in committee, you need to be constantly, consistently delivering these personal directives to the chair, and they will pass it up to the crisis staff who will be in another room. So the reason it's so crucial for you to consistently, 5 to 10 minute basis, maybe 20 at a maximum, be passing these personal directives is to, again, further your personal goals. In crisis, there's much more emphasis on a personal crisis arc, on a personal uh, end goal at the end of the committee, which could be in contrast or could be similar to the committee-wide goal, right? But you have way more individual resources, way more individual power as a delegate in crisis, most usually, because your portfolio powers. So just a brief introduction to portfolio powers. It's essentially the resources that are at your disposal in the committee. Now, through committee, you can work to kind of expand those portfolio power resources by acquiring them, by kind of just retaining more power, retaining more resources. These resources could really be anything: raw material, natural resources, alliances, military weaponry, just overall strength and overall power and resources. That is a portfolio power. Uh, at first, they are somewhat ambiguous. You research them based off your country or your character, but then you can kind of add on to them through committee if you have a plausible means of achieving those resources, of gaining and acquiring those resources, and you have very well written notes explaining to the crisis staff how you will intend and how you will acquire those resources. Now, next slide, we have a personal directive example. So this is from PW1, our first conference at Plano West in the Crisis Committee, Max Keating representing China in the Security Council. His directive here is kind of planning to assassinate Saddam Hussein. For me personally, this was and still is one of the best personal directives I'd ever read. It's very detailed, it's very specific, and it's very clear and concise. It gets straight to the point, but it's still very articulate and very specific. Keyword on this is specific. He included what resources he'd use, his military. Okay, he included he didn't just say he would be using Chinese weapons, but he specified, okay, I will be using these kinds of Chinese weapons best fit for this assassination of Saddam Hussein. And he also included a motive and a reasoning for doing this, that being oil in Iraq, those Chinese interest in oil, which are a great part of China's economy. That also plays into his crisis arc. Great job there. Um, he explains how he'll transport his assassins to Baghdad in order to assassinate Saddam Hussein, and he also makes up and compensates for any possible failures, anything that might go wrong, toward the end of the directive. So overall, a very well-written note. And the next note, Tejal, next slide, thank you, Tejal, is same delegate. So here he just is planning the invasion of Iran to end this Iran-Iraq conflict. And excuse me, again, very specific, includes his reasoning and his motives, and he's just very specific throughout the note, and it's very well structured. It's very easy to read and follow. And as you can see there at the bottom, that it was approved and successful. Next slide down. This is essentially the flow of crisis. You propose on the caucus, right? So no formal agenda setting by any means, but you can start, like Tejal said, with a round robin or a moderated caucus, and through that you get a crisis update from staff, new problems to address, new issues. You discuss those issues, you introduce your directives and your working papers to the table, vote for them, and then you keep going. And throughout this entire cycle, you need to be writing your personal directives to further your own personal goals, right? While still being a leader in committee at the same time. Excuse me. And lastly, pretty crucial to crisis, not quite unique, still used in standard, but especially more important now in crisis, is a forming blocks. So when forming blocks, you need to find other delegates whose interests align with that of your own. Um, because in committee, you need to be able to write these joint personal directives with the help of another delegate, and that other delegate needs to have similar interests to that of your own, so that they do not betray you, or just at least decrease the likelihood of them betraying you. So these alliances I recommend straight from the get-go, straight from the get-go, even before committee has begun. You need to just start talking to people, getting to know the chair, getting to know the other delegates around you in the room, start getting their names, even if you don't talk about MUN, even if you don't talk about the crisis simulation, or not the crisis simulation, but the crisis committee. You just need to start talking with people, get to know them, and maybe start talking a little bit about the crisis, getting to know, just getting a feel for the views throughout the room, who would maybe work with you. Maybe if you want to assassinate a delegate, you could start talking to someone who might be interested in doing that. It all depends. And lastly, numbers and voting procedure always win. They always outweigh expertise, even though it is good to have some experienced delegates in your block. The more delegates in general that you can get to vote for your resolutions, the better, because the more votes you get, the more resolutions you get passed on your behalf, the more wins you will receive, and the higher your chances of winning an award. But in essence, that is Crisis Committee. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to see more about crisis, we have that parliamentary procedure guide, and we have those lecture notes for you to look through. Those are far more specific and intricate. This was only a brief review, but that is essentially it for Crisis Committee. Thank you so much.